I'm really super excited that Jamie could join us today. Jamie helps organisations get better performance through stronger cultures. He's a partner at Culture That Works with Maddie Grant, who is also here, and she'll be talking to you guys later. Jamie brings 20 years of experience in conflict resolution, diversity, leadership, and management to his consulting work with organisations. He's an accomplished speaker and author, and he's written several books, including this one. I think you are going to get a lot out of this session, so please welcome to the stage our first keynote speaker, Jamie Notter.
Thanks a lot. All right, first order of business obviously has to be me explaining my voice. Because if I don't explain it, I've come across this, if I don't explain it, people worry. You're worried, oh, you're sick, can I get you some tea? No, I'm fine. This is a strange food allergy. It does not hurt me to talk. I am under a doctor's care. I'm actually on steroids right now. So if you're thinking, I'm looking forward to this Jamie Notter keynote, but I wish it could be a Jamie Notter keynote on steroids. That's what you're gonna get. Having said that out loud, I'm now concerned that I'm not managing expectations well, but anyway. I want to talk about making cultures that work. Okay, making cultures that work in the 21st century. And to start that conversation, I want to talk about two PhD historians. Okay, their names are Strauss and Howe, and they are the leading experts in this country on the topic of generational difference. Okay, they literally wrote the book on generations, and more than 20 years ago. And so if you want to learn about the generations in today's workforce, which is a popular topic, you want to talk about the millennials and the Gen X and baby boomers, they're your go-to source. There's lots of people that write about this, but read them first. But remember that they are PhD historians. I don't want to talk about just the micro level. They're good at explaining why every 20 years or so a new generation comes along. But they've actually looked at the big picture. They've identified not just the 3 generations in today's workforce. They've identified 18 generations in the United States dating back to the early 1600s. And one thing that they've noticed that I think is particularly important for us today is that not just every 20 years when a generation shifts, every 4 generations, there's a huge transition in this country. Okay? It's about 80, 90, 100 years, it depends, because generations are roughly 20 years. But every 4 generations, there's a huge transition. Okay, the first one was the American Revolution, 1770s. Obviously a big transition in this country. The colonial era ended and our first era as a nation began, right? So flash forward 4 generations from the American Revolution, where do you get? Actually, it's literally 7 years later, according to Lincoln, you get to the American Civil War. 4 generations, about 80 years or so later, another huge crisis and transition in this country. And then like clockwork, 4 generations later, you get into the 20th century. You know what 80 to 90 years after the Civil War is? The Great Depression and World War II. Huge transition in this country between the era that was pre-modern and the modern era in this country in the 20th century. All right, so here's where it gets a little freaky. Flash forward 4 generations from the Depression and World War II. Can anyone guess where we get? We get to right now. Today is literally 4 generations, roughly 80 years from that time period. So according to this theory, which has been working like clockwork for centuries, we are in the middle of a huge transition. Now, honestly, I'm not sure what that transition is, and I'm not going to spend my time guessing. I mean, I know there's a lot going on in the world today. There's the terrorism threat, there's this pretty big recession that we've had, social media revolution. There's a lot changing. But I don't know if that qualifies as like Civil War level change or Great Depression level change. But I'm not going to try and guess what that big transition is, because I'm not about predicting the future. But I also don't want to get caught on the backside of this. I want to stay ahead of it. This pattern has worked like clockwork for several hundred years. I think it's going to keep going. So I want to look around, look at our world today, and find something that is going through this kind of 80, 90, 100-year transition. What do we have out there that has been roughly the same for the last 100 years, is starting to crumble, and maybe we're starting to see new ways of doing it that are going to last 4 generations? And so when Maddie and I did the research for Humanize, we discovered one such thing. It may not be the only one, but it's the one that we write about. And it is management. Okay? Leadership and management. The way we lead and manage organizations hasn't changed in decades. It might have been tweaked along the way, but it hasn't changed in about 4 generations. It's starting to crumble. Shows like The Office pretty much exemplify how it's crumbling. Or Dilbert, you pick them. And there are, as I'm going to say in a few minutes, there are organizations that are doing it in a radically different way and succeeding at the process. So think back actually literally 70 to 100 years ago from today. That would put you in 1914 to 1944. Obviously a time of huge transition in this country. We had 2 world wars and a Great Depression during that time. But you know what else happened during that time period roughly? Management was invented. Okay? The way we manage organizations today, this hasn't existed throughout history. We didn't do this before. Before the 20th century, we were an agricultural economy, a shopkeeper economy. We didn't need the management that we have today. But when we hit the Industrial Revolution, we needed a different kind of management, so we invented one. It was invented in the early 20th century, literally by this guy. Anybody know who this guy is? This is Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor is known as the father of modern management. He and his colleagues in the early 20th century invented the way we do things today. It hasn't changed since that time. Okay, strategic planning that most organizations engage in was invented in the 1930s and really perfected in the 1950s and 1960s. And it hasn't changed since then. The way we motivate employees, the way we incentivize them, the way we compensate them, that was literally based on research that this man did. Now, granted, he was studying the motivation of laborers that were loading bars of pig iron onto railway cars. So I think maybe we need to update our research a little, but we still use those principles when we motivate, incentivize, and reward employees today. It hasn't changed in 100 years. And this way that we've managed, because Frederick Taylor invented management in the early 20th century, you have to remember, this was a time when machines were transforming our world, right? So our approach to management has been largely mechanical. It's based on the way machines work. And that's been good for us. I mean, obviously between 1914 and today, there have been tremendous gains in productivity, in efficiency, right? We've got, where we are today is because we adopted this mechanical approach to management. But as Strauss and House say, we're at the end of an era. This approach is starting to show some weaknesses. It's starting to show the cracks in the foundation. You look at how we manage organizations and you see problems that we can't solve. Okay, and the number one, I've heard this mentioned several times today. I know you guys are working on this, but it is the problem of organizational agility. Right? Every industry that I go in, the one thing that they complain about is that they can't keep up with the pace of change. We can't respond fast enough to the customers. We can't respond fast enough to the changes in the marketplace. We can't be agile. And you want to know why you can't be agile? It's because you're running your organizations like machines, and machines suck at agility. Okay? They are not designed to be agile. They are designed to do the same thing over and over again with perfection and repeatability. And that's nice, but they're not good at changing midstream. Now you may think, well, how is this possible? Like, as human beings, it is in our DNA to be adaptable. Okay? We are at the top of the food chain, evolutionarily speaking, because we adapt, because we can change and grow and learn, because we can live in climates that we're not even supposed to live in. Right? We figure this stuff out. This is what we do as human beings. How is it possible that we create organizations that can't do that? And again, the answer is because we created organizations that are incompatible with what it means to be human. We create machine-based organizations that don't tap in to the inherent power of what it means to be a human being. And we see this over and over again in the employee engagement data. And I saw a quote earlier from the Gallup report. You've seen the 2013 Gallup report? It shows that 70% of employees worldwide are not engaged at work. 7 out of 10. 2 out of 10, by the way, are so actively disengaged, 20%, they're intentionally trying to sabotage their own organizations. 3 out of 10 are doing the work of your organization. I wonder actually what kind of productivity and efficiency gains we could have achieved if we increased that number. But guess what? For 10 years, which is about as long as I've seen data on employee engagement, the numbers haven't moved. We know that our numbers are horrible, and we try to improve them, and we can't. And we can't because we are stuck in a machine approach to management. The good news in this story is that there are organizations that are doing it differently. There are organizations that are embracing more human principles and actually succeeding wildly in the process. Okay? So I want to give you some examples of those so you see what it looks like. And I'm going to talk about 3 of them and 3 principles that Maddie and I identified in the book Humanize that these companies are exemplifying. The first example comes from Zappos. Okay? And I love talking about Zappos. Everybody loves talking about Zappos. How many people buy stuff from Zappos? Yeah, most of the hands are going up, okay? We love Zappos. Now, one of the reasons I like talking about them as an example of organizations that are doing things differently is because they've been incredibly successful. Okay, look at the numbers on Zappos. They went from $1 million in sales to $1 billion in sales in like 8 years. Okay, $1 million to $1 billion. And they did that selling shoes online. Shoes, the things that you have to go try on and walk around in, they can manage to get from $1 million to $1 billion selling those online. I still don't know how that's possible. And I understand there's a lot of things that went into their success, but one of them is this principle. Zappos embraces the idea of decentralization. And I've heard the decentralization theme come up today already, so I know you guys know this. Zappos has a bunch of their employees are call center employees. Call center employees, typically, you tell me if this is the same for you guys, are not the top of the org chart, okay? They're a little bit lower down. But at Zappos, they give their call center employees ridiculous amounts of authority and control. Every call center employee at Zappos has the authority to upgrade your account whenever they want without asking permission. They can send your stuff with free shipping anytime they want without asking anybody's permission or getting approval on it. Zappos call center employees can spend as much time as they want on the phone with you at their discretion. Now, if you run a call center, that is not a best practice. The best practices in call center says you get people on the phone and off the phone quickly, because that way we can handle a larger volume of calls with the number of people we have. And we don't want to hire more people because that's not efficient. That is the machine approach. You would never do this if you took the machine approach, but they do it. And what do they get by decentralizing? They get ridiculously happy customers. They get customers that are completely wowed by the experience because they get what they need when they need it from the people that they're actually talking to. And they also get ridiculously happy, engaged employees because they get employees who can be themselves, who can make their own decisions, who feel like they have power and autonomy. As human beings, we want that. It's in our DNA. And they get that kind of engagement by embracing this principle. All right, second example comes from Whole Foods. Whole Foods, also a ridiculously successful company. They, I think they still have it. I haven't checked the numbers recently, but they've been the highest per square foot profit in the entire grocery industry for some time. They are ridiculously successful, and they do it by embracing the idea of transparency. Now, I know you guys get transparency. I've been listening to it. You're setting up these internets so internally people can see things and see more and get more communication. You like the idea. So tell me if you're doing what Whole Foods is doing. They share all of their salary and bonus data internally with everybody. Who's doing that? Anybody? No. When I tell people this, they freak out. Okay, I did a blog post about this. I've never had so many negative comments on my blog. They're like, that's the worst idea in the history of mankind. They're like, it's none of your business what I make. I'm like, okay, fine. Well, you don't have to share your salary data. But Whole Foods does it, and they don't do it just because it's cool or because they read about it in Humanize, although I would have loved that. They do it because it helps the system work better. Okay, their bonus system is team-based. So if you run a produce shop and your produce shop achieves certain metrics, that triggers a bonus for everybody in your team. They want every team to be able to see real time across the entire country which teams are getting the bonuses and which ones aren't. Because if you're running the shop in Wichita and you notice that the shop in Long Island is doing really well, you call them up. You call them up and you find out what they're doing. And you don't copy it. You don't copy a best practice, because that's very mechanical. You learn from what they're doing. The context in Long Island is different than the context in Wichita. You're going to do something differently in your context, but you implement it, and suddenly you're getting the bonuses, and that's when Sacramento calls you, and then they adapt it. So by inserting this layer of transparency, they get a system that is agile. They get a system that learns from itself, that changes without somebody telling them how to do it. That's speed, that's agility, that's what everyone wants. You get that when you add things like transparency. My third quick example, and this one actually comes from multiple organizations. Google, 3M, Intuit, and actually many more. These are ones that I've read about most in the press. They do this, they have the same process. I think 3M did it before Google, but Google's the one that's known for it. It's the 20% time. You heard of the 20% time? Okay. All the engineers at Google, they've changed this, but originally all the engineers at Google, 80% of their time they have to spend on the Google core business. That's what's in their job descriptions. They're working on that. 20% of their time, 1 day a week, they get to experiment. Okay, the principle here is experimentation. They can work on any project they want. They don't need to get approval. It doesn't have to come from a list. Anything they want. Now, it has to be supportive of Google, right? It can't be learning to play the guitar. They're not going to do that. But creating this container for experimentation means that while there, and then flashback several years ago, Google was originally, if you remember, a search engine company and a search engine and advertising company only. Someone, an engineer at Google, started working on Gmail, started working on an email platform for Google. Now, if they had asked approval from the managers would have said no, because they're not in that business. That's what internet service providers do. That's what AOL does. How could we compete with them, right? You've got mail. So we don't do that. So we couldn't get approval on that. But they had the room to experiment. They could try it, and iteratively they learned that it had potential. Eventually they got behind it as an organization, and now it's a huge part of their profits. 3M did the same thing before Google did it. I've heard really impressive stories at Intuit about how employees in India used it to actually change and address the problem of farmer suicide in India while making money for the company. That's innovation. That's new things. That's the same kind of agility. That's creating new products before someone has the brilliant idea at the top that it's a good new product. But you have to create these containers for experimentation. So, again, take a step back. Strauss and Howe are arguing that we are in the middle of a huge transition period, not just like a generational thing like the millennials are new and different, this happens every 20 years. No, every 4 generations, every 80 to 100 years, there's a huge change where something ends, an era ends, and a new era begins. Ironically, 80 years ago, management was invented, and it is currently starting to crumble. And organizations that are succeeding wildly are embracing new ideas like decentralization and transparency and experimentation. And for those of you that win the book, you'll also learn about inclusion and authenticity and truth and learning and personal development. Organizations that are doing this are succeeding wildly. So I really want to emphasize that we are at a time where you guys as organizations have to make a choice. Are you going to stay ahead of this curve, or are you going to react to it in 5 years? The ones that stay ahead of it are going to be more successful. The obvious question then is, okay, so what do we need to do? So here's the bad news. Prepare yourself for this next slide. In order to get on this train, in order to get ahead of this curve, you are going to have to change your culture. Now, I know that some of you guys are working on it. I know that some of you guys are using this technology to actually work on culture issues. But you can't get to this next level using the culture that you inherited. And I'd love to say that you can copy Whole Foods, that you can copy Zappos. The books that they write about these cultures are awesome. It makes me want to go out and do that in every company that I run into. But you can't copy a culture. Whole Foods and Zappos and 3M and Intuit, they built those cultures. They built them from the ground up. They put those principles in at the beginning. You guys, maybe you did, but maybe you didn't. The cultures that you have are probably developed accidentally. They developed organically, so they inherited this mechanical approach. You're gonna have to roll up your sleeves, wade in knee deep, start changing behaviors, changing processes, using different language. It's gonna be a lot of work, right? I don't wanna sugarcoat this, but I also don't wanna scare you away. This is work you know how to do. This is work we've been doing. We've been creating our cultures for the last 10 years in every organization that you're in. We just haven't been doing it with intention. And we haven't been doing it with this transition in mind, this transition that we are moving towards a human era in business and away from a mechanical one. So I want to encourage you guys to get on the plan to change your culture. And I know I only have an hour with you today. I can't give you everything you need to know about culture. So I decided to boil it down to 2 lessons. 2 lessons because I know that I don't have a room full of CEOs. You guys are not all the ones in charge, that's fine. It doesn't matter where you are in the organization, you can take these 2 ideas and you can apply them and start moving the needle on culture, okay? The first one, I think, is the most important piece in understanding culture and how to change culture. Because we tend to think of it as, I'm gonna read this book about this great culture and I wanna embrace those ideas, and it's not that simple. There's a critical step that most of us miss. The first thing you need to do when working on your culture is connect what is valued to what drives success. Look at your organization more carefully. Understand what drives the success of the enterprise. Part of this is strategy, but part of this is implementing strategy. How do you do it so you know that it's going to work? What really drives our success? And then you have to connect that to what we value internally. What is really valued deeply inside our organizations. And I want to point out that I use the word valued with a D as opposed to values with an S. Because if I start talking about values, I'm afraid that the next thing that's going to happen is an offsite retreat where you go and you rewrite your value statement and it sounds gorgeous and beautiful and you put it on posters and up on the wall and up on the website and everyone says, yeah, we're about integrity and honesty and excellence and quality and whatever else you come up with, and it gets ignored. Enron had really beautiful values, by the way, and they were up on the wall in their lobby, but that's not what they valued. You need to figure this out. Zappos did this. Zappos figured out what drove their success. And they have actually a very pretty value statement. It's lovely. Number 1 on their value statement is, we give customer a wow experience. Okay, not just a good experience. They want their customers to get off the phone and go, wow, that was amazing. They know that if you're selling shoes online, the only way you're gonna grow is if you completely blow people away. So what do they value internally? They value decentralization. They value putting control in the hands of the people that are talking to the customers. It's a direct link between what is valued and what drives success. And when that becomes clear, people live it. Now, I do want to point out that if you are in a position of authority, if you do have many people reporting to you, this one is really important because everyone is going to look to you to demonstrate that you value what is really valued internally. So if you value decentralization, if that drives success, you think that's going to drive success in your organization, and you go to your direct report and you're like, hey, how's this project going? And they say, oh, it's great, we've already shipped it. It's out, the customer has it. It's on the website, it's live, it's done, it's gone. If your reaction is, whoa, 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 did those changes get made? Did I see that? Have I approved this? Have I signed off on this? You're not valuing decentralization. You have to pay attention to your behavior and make sure you value it. Because if you answer like that, the next time you go and you say to someone, hey, how's this project? You know what they're going to tell you? They're going to say it's on your desk waiting for approval. It's in your inbox. And you've just lost the speed, the agility, and the engagement that you thought you had when you were embracing decentralization. So pay attention to your own behavior on this one. And that's for anybody who has any direct reports. So connect what is valued to what drives success. Second piece, if you want to change cultures, I'm a big fan. I know that culture change takes time, and it's a process. But if we wait for the whole process to be articulated to us, sometimes we miss it. So I'm a big fan of saying culture can be changed one process at a time. okay? And you guys are doing that on the technology side, but it's not just technology. If you're gonna change your culture, you have to change some management processes. There's processes that we use in organizations to get the work done, and there's processes that we use to manage getting the work done. And for some reason, we focus more on the getting it done piece than the management piece. And the management piece is what reinforces our culture. We need to change management processes. So there's two areas that I like to focus on when I tell people to do this. The first is HR. And I know that you guys from a technology side are doing a lot on HR, particularly around administrative processes, making it easier, making work suck less. By the way, Maddie and I signed all of these books for the people who are winning it, and I inscribed every book, Make Work Suck Less. Okay, I want to remind you of that message. But the HR processes I'm talking about are the ones that are really about humans. Hiring, onboarding, and performance reviews. Every organization that I have come across that has a ridiculously strong culture, that is embracing these human ideas, almost everyone to a T doesn't hire like everybody else, and they don't onboard like everybody else, and they don't do performance management like everybody else. They change those processes radically because who you bring in and how you teach them what the culture is and what you reward, which is about what's valued, is critical to culture. You have to do those things differently. So I implore people, anyone who has a connection to HR, have conversations about doing those processes differently once you get clear on what's valued. Because if you don't, it's going to backslide into the old way really quickly. But if you don't have access to HR, which is fine, I'm not letting you off the hook. The other management process that we need to work on in order to reinforce these new cultural values is anything related to internal collaboration. So again, I know you guys work on the technology side of internal collaboration. And the session that Maddie and I do later, which Luke said is going to be very informal, and to be honest, we're going to be asking you guys as many questions as you ask us. We're going to talk a lot about technology because Maddie comes from the technology background. She's been running a social media consulting company for several years. But outside of technology, I implore you to change one of the most fundamental internal collaboration processes that is so desperately in need of innovation. It is called the meeting. How many people spend most of their days in meetings? Here's the deal. Culture lives through interaction. It is when we work together, it is when we collaborate that we make culture alive. If I'm in my office working on code, working on a memo, working on a product, not interacting with anybody, I am not affecting the culture. As soon as I start talking to people, as soon as I start working with them, as soon as we start collaborating on something, the culture becomes alive in the way we interact. Knowing that, why do we do meetings the way we do? Everybody hates staff meetings. Everybody hates project meetings, team meetings. We can't stand them. We hate going to them. No wonder we have such low engagement. So change the way you do your meetings. If you value decentralization, why is the boss always writing the agenda? Why does the boss convene the meeting? Why does the boss decide who talks and who doesn't? That is not valuing decentralization. You want to value transparency? How about sharing all the information that you do in your meetings with everybody else in the department? I've forgotten the name of the company. It's one of the follow-ons from Twitter, I think. Their rule is if more than 2 people show up at a meeting, the notes go on the hard drive where everyone sees them and get emailed to everybody. Everybody sees what everybody else talks about. Change your processes. Do things differently. Use this to allow the culture to live and grow in a different way. So I'm going to stop here and we're going to sit down and we're going to have some questions, but I want to just remind you one more time, this is a window of opportunity. These windows only happen every 80 to 90 to 100 years. Do not miss this one. The companies that figure this out are not just going to be the ones that attract the millennial generation, which, by the way, is the largest generation, and in a few years are going to be the largest one in the workforce. But it's going to be the companies that understand a new millennial way of thinking that is going to span 4 generations from now. So set yourselves up for success. Start letting go of the mechanical approach and embracing this new human way of running organizations. I'm guaranteeing you're going to see good results from it. All right, thanks.
Awesome. Take a seat here in my living room.
And just first of all, kudos for whoever chose the Rock'em Sock'em robots. Thank you for the shout out to Gen X. We appreciate it.
I think you're winning at Connect 4 as well. That was awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us. I was excited that you used the Whole Foods reference because Daniel and I actually, when we went to South by Southwest last year, heard John Mackey talk, and it was like amazing listening to their story. They have a book, Conscious Capitalism. It's another one. You guys are going to be reading a lot after this. You were talking just then about culture in the workplace. What do you do for remote workers? Like when you have people who aren't like in the same room as you?
Well, I think that's where you have to do a lot of work on managing internal processes like meetings. So I've got a organization that I work with. They're a small organization, they have about 30 people, but they're split between Oakland, California and Washington, D.C. And so they invested in really good video conferencing technology. Their conference rooms have a video camera going basically all the time. And then they use other stuff for one-on-one meetings or groups of 2 or 3 that they just do online. But they build the video into it.
Yeah.
You know, I've been trying not to go. I know you guys do technology. Does everyone like me really hate email? Do we hate email? Can we all hate it? Okay, most of us. Email is one of the worst communication technologies ever invented. Or that's not true. It's great for sharing information. It's horrible for communicating. Okay, we need visual. We need tone. We need this in order to have human conversations. And so we instead send emails and copy 69 people on it and expect it not to fall apart. That doesn't work that way. So you have to change your processes to enable this, to have people sort of work face-to-face when they can. I know in a large distributed organization that's a challenge, but any way you can move to doing that and getting people together, I think you're going to be more successful.
Yeah, right. I actually heard when you're saying about, kind of, it's almost like windows into other offices through the virtual world. I heard a story of a company in Sydney who were looking at implementing more collaborative workspace, and they actually were building a whole wall which was a video projection of their Melbourne office. So it was almost like you could see the Melbourne people just like they were right there, but you're in Sydney. It's kind of like a cool way to connect remote places.
This is a very, very important point around culture, is that it exists in what is visible. You have to make visible the interactions. So if you can't see them, if everyone has their earbuds on and is looking at their desk, looking at their work, the products that you create might make it visible, but it limits the amount of data you have to reinforce the culture. So if you want culture change to move quickly, make things more visible. I know you guys use technology to do this, but there has to be other ways too. But everywhere you turn, look for ways to make things more visible. You'll be able to leverage the culture change.
Sure. I remember last night, Jamie and I had dinner together, and you were telling me about a company, I think it was Menlo Innovations.
Yes.
And you were telling me about how they collaborate in the office. They have one PC per 2 people in their development team. Tell us the story. I thought it was really interesting.
Maddie and I just discovered Menlo Innovations, and we were out there 2 weeks ago visiting their office, and talk about making things visible. Now, there are only 50 people, so it's not a huge organization. They are all in one room. Okay? There are no cubes, there are no offices. They work at desks that are all movable so that they can pair up, they're all paired, but they can move into groups of 3 or 4 if they need to on projects. They are software developers. They are mostly coders. Okay? You think of a software coder, you think of someone in a dark room with headphones on, just tippity-tapping, right? Like that's getting it done, writing stuff no one else can understand, owning their code. The CEO of Menlo said, we will be more effective if we collaborate more visibly all the time. So he only gives 1 computer for every pair of coders. They are constantly talking to each other as they write their code. They pass the keyboard back and forth. Okay? They have a group of employees called high-tech anthropologists. focus on user interface. They also work together. Everyone works together. Assistants for the CEO work together on one computer. They are talking to each other all the time. They collaborate with their customers. The customers come in weekly and plan out the week's activity. So the customer says, I want you to work on this week. And they literally put it on the calendar. And they're like, I also want you to work on this. And they say, you don't have that much time. There's only 40 hours, so they pull it out. They collaborate. They break that barrier down between customer and software designer. Okay? They value that so much. They value collaboration so much that they change their processes so that everything is visible. When Rich, the CEO, wants to hold an all-staff meeting, he shouts, hey, Menlo. And they all stop and they go, hey, Rich. And all the talking stops. He says, here's the announcement. We just got a new client. We're moving in this direction. This is where they're going to be starting next week. We're really excited about it. It's a 45-second all-staff meeting. And then they go back to work. If you need to work with a team, if you're a high-tech anthropologist and you need to work with a team because you have some data that you need to share with them, they have code names. You say, hey, Wilmot. And the Wilmot team stops and says, hey, Jamie. I'm like, hey, I just got this data. I want to share it with you. You guys need to use this on the project that you're working on. They're like, thanks, we'll get right to that. Meeting is done. Nobody stopped. Nobody had to go reserve a conference room. Like, they just got it done. They're fast. They're agile. People love working there. They do this by matching up the processes to what they value.
We're going to practice this after the break. Hey, collective. We'll work on this. We have a couple of days together, okay? I've just got one more question, then I'm going to open up to you guys. So if you've got questions, you're about to get your chance. You know, you said when you mentioned to the company you're working with about exposing their bonuses and salary, you know, they were like, no way. You know, and I always hear things with companies that I deal with or places I've worked before, like, oh, well, Luke, it's a slow ship to turn. If there's little things that people like us could do to like start to you know, chip away at these things or influence the people around us, what are some tips that you might have for us?
Well, I go back to the experimentation piece. The idea is to look for containers within which you can run experiments. And actually, I was telling Luke at dinner last night, I also heard John Mackey speak at a conference. That same conference I heard, I'm blanking on her name. Her last name is Kelly. She's the CEO of Gore & Associates, the people that make Gore-Tex. Very decentralized organization. They really value experimentation. But she made a point in her talk. She said, look, if you're gonna punch holes in the boat, do it above the waterline. Okay? Like, create containers for experimentation, but choose them wisely. Choose ones that are not gonna derail other people. So actually, I'll tell another story about Menlo related to this. We were visiting their office, and they gave us free rein. I mean, there's only one room, so how could they not give us free rein? So we're observing people, we're talking to them when they have time. We didn't want to, you know, mess with their work schedules. They had time, they'd come talk to us. And they came over and said, hey, there's a performance review happening in the conference room at lunch today. In Menlo, you don't have them scheduled. When you want to do a performance review, you invite your harshest critics to lunch, and they give you feedback. And they said, you guys want to sit in? And we're like, okay. And so the guy didn't mind that we sat in on this, so we listened to his performance review. And part of the feedback he was getting was that he was trying stuff and not telling anybody. He wanted to do the coding in a particular way, and he kind of hid it off to the side. And their feedback was like, look, we actually think that's some pretty creative stuff, but you got to play this chess move out 6 or 7 things down the road. You got to see how it impacts us. Because that's why we need to know. And that's why they create this structure where they literally write down tasks on cards and get those approved. You want to experiment? Write up a card. Make sure that everyone knows this isn't going to sink the boat. This is above the waterline. When they see it's above the waterline, they're like, go for it. The client says, I think this would really be valuable for us. I'm going to approve you to work on that. They actually get paid to work on their experiments. Okay? But you have to have that process of moving things 6 or 7 moves down the chessboard so you see how you impact everyone else in the system.
Cool. Guys, I want to open up to questions. We've got a few minutes, so does anyone have anything they wanted to shoot at Jamie? I think, who's got the roving mic over there? Marcus.
Thanks. One of the things that I saw when we had the three panelists up here this morning talking about their great successes is that in almost every case, the success was sponsored by an executive who led the charge. And in many cases, the culture of an organization is the personification of C-level executives. In some cases, changing that culture means that you have to change that management structure, or in some cases, move management out, or wait till management moves on, that sort of thing. How does an organization deal with, especially a large organization, deal with that need to drive culture change when so much of that is the personification of an old established management hierarchy?
Yes. So a little confession on my part. I'm a systems guy. We in Humanize, one of the 12 principles we talk about is systems thinking. I don't like the fact that the leaders, the CEOs, have so much power. I don't like it. I don't want it to be true. I know that it's true, particularly around culture, and specifically if they are the founder. Okay? Founder culture change is different than any other kind of culture change. Okay? But I know that CEOs drive it. But there's a couple points I want to make. One is they drive it because we let them. We give them the power. Part of it is because we don't want it. We got enough to do. We're really busy, we're down in the middle, we're managing all this stuff. We don't want to decide what the culture is and own it and drive it and make sure we go there. We want someone else to do it. The world is complex, it's easier if they do it. So part of it is, if you have access to those people, make sure you have conversations about their behavior and what they're going to do. Push them on culture change. I worked with an organization in Australia on culture change. The COO spent 50% of his time on culture. Okay? And they did it. So it does take time. So if you have access to that group, convince them that this is important. Show them that there are results. The other piece is, if you want to convince them, then don't tell, if I had a lawyer, they'd tell me not to say stuff like this. Go rogue, okay? Go and do some stuff on your own. Do some stuff on the side. Create some experiments that show results. And then come to them and say, hey, I did this experiment above the waterline. I did this experiment and I got some results, and it's really cool. I think we should talk about it more. And if that doesn't work, here's another one where I get into trouble. Quit. Leave. Start a startup. One thing that we wrote about in Humanize that has not been popularly adopted is the idea that if we want human organizations, we have to be more comfortable with separations. We have to fire a lot more people, and a lot of us have to quit. We have to move. At Menlo, people leave and then come back 5 years later. And they're totally okay with that. It's not like, ooh, what if people leave and they take the information with us? No, what if they leave and grow and come back? How awesome would that be? What if they leave and start a startup and then they want to bring that inside? What if they stay and then new people come in? Like, we have to go where we need to go as human beings, where we need to go to develop and learn. Because it's sort of the idea of, people say, oh, well, what if we invest all this money and we train these people and we educate them and we teach them and we've developed these employees and then they go leave? And I'm like, what if you don't develop them and they stay? Okay? We have to expect people to come and go, and we have to expect that we're building the system's capacity all the time. And part of that is, life is short. You want work to suck less? Find better companies. If you can't create it internally, find one. If you can't find one, and this is the Gen X in me, go create one. But we don't have time to wait around for people to get it anymore. We have to do that ourselves.
Awesome. Got some more questions? Yep, there's one over there. Could you just tell us who you are? I can't really see you.
It's me, Sophie, from Costa Rica.
Hey.
Well, you were doing the research for the book. I'm pretty sure it was mostly based in the US. And I wanted to shed a little bit of light on what happens outside of the US, for example, in Costa Rica. The whole idea of work from home is something that is not applicable. The companies just stopped doing it because they realized it didn't work, and they thought it would be better for people to come into the office and socialize. And what happened was when people would go to the office and socialize, they wouldn't work. And when they were at home not socializing, they weren't working either. So the whole idea that you're presenting of people actually being engaged with their company is something that, for me, is super important. But it's because I've had the possibility to study abroad and see a different way of how companies should work. If you could take a little bit of time and go down to Costa Rica and sit down with everyone there, it would be perfect. I could find you a place to go talk. I'll get you to the MBA programs, to the universities, because the problem is in Costa Rica, we have a bunch of companies from the States, but they're being managed by people from Costa Rica. So we can't get all of this great creative thinking that you guys have here and have it developed in Costa Rica because the mentality is very Latino to it. So for me, being engaged with the company I work, wearing their shirts, being proud of it, is what makes me really happy. But that's just one person out of, we're about 5.5 million people there. So if you want to come down to Costa Rica and talk, I'll hook you up with everyone you need to talk to.
Definitely, definitely. No, I will admit freely that, and Patty and I have talked about this, we knew that the book that we wrote was US-centric, and we weren't putting that out there as we have the answer, which unfortunately is the common American approach, I'm afraid, is to say, oh, look at what we're doing, it's the best. It's just the data that we had, and we did not have the resources at that time to sort of do a global study on what principles might be driving this. And part of that is because I don't know that we'll find universal principles that will work in every culture. And so we wanted to highlight the ones that we were discovering here. And it is part of our agenda long-term to look at different regions and different cultures and try and figure out how it's going to be different. Because I think some of the elements are going to be woven through every culture, but they're going to manifest themselves in ways that they're just so different. There's not going to be a sort of a cookie-cutter approach. And yes, we totally want to go to Costa Rica.
I feel like when I put the Oprah thing up this morning, like this is like going to take us right through the whole thing. Like you get a book, you're going to Costa Rica. What's next? Tomorrow we all get in a car. Brian's no. Has anyone else got any more questions? We've got about a couple minutes left, so there's time for one more, I think. There's one in there.
For the success stories, you gave a lot of examples of companies that are newer, that probably have young people managing the company. Do you have any examples where an older company that have been around that feel like they're the best at what they do, but they're resistant to change?
A company that had a different culture and transformed it? Anything off the top of your head, Maddie? Well, I'll say that the companies that we've looked at that are doing it differently are not necessarily run by young people. In fact, most of the positions of power in organizations right now are still run by boomers. Okay, this is 3 generations back. You've got millennials, Generation X, and boomers. They're still being run by those people. Companies that are embracing these new millennial values, these new millennial ideas, are still folks run by other generations. They're making these shifts. I haven't seen the company, but the companies that I think that are doing the best at it are ones that have been building these values in from the beginning. So the work that I'm focused on now is companies that get that they need to change that. I've been working with a lot of small companies on that because I can see the change quicker. But again, it's not that hard to change this. This company in Australia that I worked with, they simply changed the way they hired people. And they saw immediate shifts, immediate changes in behaviors in employees, the way they took ownership, because they actually gave people a chance to work there Or Menlo is another example. Almost all of their employees are on contract. They all start on a 3-month contract because they know it can't be permanent. I can't hire you until I've seen you work. They do a group interview for the first stage, and then after that, if you pass that, you come in for 1 day. They pay you for 1 day as of work. I think it's $10 an hour. But they pay you and you work on a real project for a day. If you pass that, you come in and then it's a 3-week contract, and then you have the chance of being hired. But they have to do that differently because they have to see you act. And I don't see that as being limited to a company that is run by young people. I don't see that a process like that as being limited to a company that's either new or has been around for 100 years. You can change your hiring process. Now, it may take a while to implement it, on scale. You may have to figure some things out in the process. But there's nothing holding back any organization from doing something like that, from changing the way they do these processes to reinforce these values. And I think you guys are doing that with technology. I hope we can talk about it in the session later. You're changing the technology. You are changing the culture. That's part of the work you're doing. You can't just implement the technology by telling people what to do with instructions. You're actually requiring them to behave in ways that might run counter to the way the culture has been established over the last 50 years. And so you're going to have to open those conversations. The ones that do that and have those conversations better, I think are going to get the technology implementation, that 91% or whatever you guys are shooting for. That's when you can align the culture work with the technology work.
I know when you were asking about a big company, I don't want to put Sylvia on the spot, but Sylvia's from Kraft Foods. She's here in the room somewhere, but she has a session, I think it's tomorrow. It's the spirit of a startup with the soul of a powerhouse, and it's about the transformation of culture at Kraft, and it's an awesome story. I was blown away by it on Friday when we did our session review. So if you're interested in this and you want to hear a story of a company that really shifted from physical to right through culture, pop along to that one. It's going to be an excellent story. Is there any other questions before we close this session out? There is one over here. Yeah. Mike.
So tying a couple of these questions together, actually. So the challenges in Costa Rica, and you talked a little bit about what you've looked at being very U.S.-centric. I think we have a lot of global organizations in the room, most likely. I work for one. And it introduces a lot of challenges, right, when you talk about cultural change in a global organization. Different cultures, right, adapt differently to change and adapt differently in different organizations. So I know it's a large challenge. Your study has been, mostly U.S.-centric, but do you have any principles or thoughts about how a global organization can, right? People have traveled, and folks in APAC approach their company very differently and how they work in it, and they engage very differently with senior leaders and people they work with closely. You go to Europe, it's very different. You go to U.S., it's very different. So taking this, a lot of what you outlined, you don't like it, go do an experiment, change it, leave, quit. Some of those other cultures would never think of some of that stuff, It's just not, it's ingrained very deeply in the way, who they are as humans. So in a global organization, and where we're so dependent on these other regions and how they operate, and incorporating their work product into what we do you have any principles or thoughts into how you can take this kind of fundamental change and to culture and make it effective?
Yeah, so there's a really important principle, I think, in management in general, but culture change specifically. And that is the idea of what I call middle-level thinking. So I think in a large system, the larger the system, the more diverse. I mean, you guys in large organizations, you have multiple cultures. You don't just have one culture. Even if you're not global, you're just in the US, you're a large system, you still have multiple cultures. And you have an overall culture. Every time you have a system like that, what we're looking for is what I call middle-level insight. So you have your high-level principles. You figure out what drives success of the enterprise. You come up with what's valued. That will end up being boiled down to some sort of values statement or some sort of document that says this is what's important to us. But it doesn't fill in all the gaps. That's high level. And then you have all the process stuff, which is how you do things. That's sort of micro, that's low level. But what we miss, these middle level principles that really help us understand why we're doing what we're doing and that guide our decision making. And so in a large distributed system or in a global system, you have to go to these other countries, you have to have conversations as, hey, at headquarters in the US, we came up with these ideas. We think this is what's going to drive our success. What does that mean to you? What does that mean to you in your context? And in that conversation, we're going to develop some sort of middle-level ideas that are maybe somewhat unique to that culture, to that country, to that department. But they guide the decision-making in a way that makes sense there. And you have to let it evolve organically like that. So it can't be, we came up with our value statement, it's these 9 things, you're now going to be evaluated on those 9 things the way that I think they should be done here in New York. It has to be, here are the nine guidelines, and then at our different levels, we're going to have conversations of what that means, and there's going to be some variation because that's the way systems work. They just aren't uniform. I'd love them to be like machines where everyone does it the exact same way every time, but they're not going to because they have human beings. What we need is that discipline, is to have those conversations. What does middle-level insight look like here? How do we take what we learned in this context and apply it in this context? What would those principles look like? And through that conversation, we can come to agreement on that. Even though it doesn't make sense to me, it's not how I would do it in DC, but I get that that's how you do it in Costa Rica, so that's cool. We have to have those conversations. So it's really about building those in. And again, I think that applies in any large system internally. There's always going to be that middle-level insight that you got to get clear on, because that's what's going to really guide behavior.
Cool. I think we're out of time. Jamie, thank you for joining us. If you still have questions, straight after lunch, Jamie and Maddie are going to be in track A, the adoption track, with a workshop conversation with Jamie and Maddie. So please join me in thanking Jamie for sharing his story.